Today's episode is brought to you by Sarah Krasnostein's The Believer, Encounters with the Beginning, the End, and Our Place in the Middle, which James Glick calls deeply beautiful and never simple. Through 6 profiles of a death doula, of a geologist who believes the world is 6,000 years old, of a lecturer in neurobiology who spends his weekends ghost hunting, of the fiancé of a disappeared pilot and UFO enthusiast, of a woman incarcerated for killing her husband after suffering years of domestic violence, and of Mennonite families in New York. Krasnostein takes readers on an unforgettable tour of the human condition that explores our universal need for belief to help us make sense of life, death, and everything in between. Says Alex Marzano-Lesnevich, if reading a book can make you more human, The Believer does just that. The Believer is out now from Tin House. Today's conversation with Alejandro Zambra is a dream come true for me. As a longtime lover of his work, preparing for this conversation was extra gratifying as it prompted me to discover his nonfiction, his book Not to Read from Fitzcarraldo Editions, and how much his nonfiction and fiction are in conversation. And also to find myself loving his new book, his new novel, Chilean Poet, the one we focus on today, perhaps more than any other. I can't speak for Alejandro, but for me it felt like we had an immediate rapport, an ease at finding a place to talk about literature in a way that I normally associate with longtime friends. You definitely get the distinct sense of his lifelong love of words and writing and the communities that emerge from this world of writers. And I'm excited to share this with you today. I'm also excited to have a guest on about a book that was not written in English, because each time this happens, not as much as I would like, it gives me an opportunity to talk with their translator for the bonus audio archive. The archive in its own right, I think, is a great incentive to become a listener supporter of Between the Covers, with everything from readings to craft talks. But the translator conversations may be the greatest reason to do it, because they are long-form conversations, entire episodes in and of themselves. And today's bonus conversation is with Megan McDowell, who not only has translated Zambra since his second book, but also translates Mariana Enriquez, Samantha Schweblin, Alejandro Jodorowsky, and Lena Merwane, who came on the show years ago now for her book Seeing Red. To learn more about the bonus audio archive and the other potential benefits of becoming a listener supporter of Between the Covers, of which there are many, head over to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's conversation with Alejandro Zambra. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is Chilean novelist, short story writer, essayist, and poet Alejandro Zambra. Zambra studied at the Instituto Nacional General José Miguel Carrera and the University of Chile, where he graduated with a degree in Hispanic literature. On scholarship, he pursued an MA in Hispanic Studies in Madrid, and upon returning to Chile, a doctorate in literature from Pontifical Catholic University. For many years, he worked as a literary critic for the newspaper La Tercera and was professor at the School of Literature at Diego Portales University in Santiago. He now lives in Mexico City with his partner, novelist and essayist Jasmina Barrera, who also has a book coming out this year, Linea Nigra, an essay on pregnancy and earthquakes from Two Lines Press. Zambra is the author of 2 books of poems, Bahia Inutil and Mudanza, and a collection of essays, No Leer, which was published by Fitzcarraldo Editions as Not to Read. But Zambra is best known for his fiction. His debut novel, Bonsai, was awarded the Critic of Chile Award and the National Council of Reading and Books Award, both for Best Novel of 2006. 2 years later, it was a finalist for Best Translated Book of the Year, and soon Zambra was on all the lists. He was selected as one of Granta's Best of Young Spanish Language Novelists, and as one of the Bogota 39, a list of the best Latin American writers under the age of 39. His other novels include The Private Lives of Trees and Ways of Going Home, which won the Altazor Prize, was selected by the National Book Council as the best Chilean novel published in 2012, and won an English Pen Award. He's also the author of the unclassifiable book Multiple Choice, written in the form of a standardized test, named a Best Book of the Year by NPR, The Guardian, and the Irish Times, as well as the equally acclaimed short story collection My Documents. His stories have appeared in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, Harper's, Tin House, and McSweeney's, and he's here today to talk about his latest novel, entitled Chilean Poet, and translated, like most of the books mentioned, by Megan McDowell. Kirkus Review calls Chilean Poet a playful, discursive novel about families, relationships, poetry, and how easily all 3 can come together or fall apart. A book that renders both the small moments of literary striving and the everyday difficulties of being part of and raising a family with an insight that's both clear-eyed and tender. Samantha Schweblin adds, his clever irony, his light-hearted yet powerful prose, his gift for capturing this life that passes through and yet still escapes us, everything Zambra has already put into practice in his novellas and short stories explodes with vitality in Chilean Poet. Contemporary, beautiful, brilliant. Rivka Galchin adds, every beat and pattern of being alive becomes revelatory and bright when narrated by Alejandro Zambra. Valeria Luiselli concurs by saying, when I read Zambra, I feel like someone's shooting fireworks inside my head. And finally, Rodrigo Frezan says, Chilean Poet is intelligent and funny and moving and profound. It's been a long time since I've laughed so hard or been so moved by a novel. Welcome to Between the Covers, Alejandro Zambra.
Thank you, David. Thank you for this invitation.
So both you and your partner, Hasmina, have books coming out this year that engage with becoming a parent. And I imagine that you were working on this book either in anticipation of becoming a father to your now 4-year-old son or during the early years of fatherhood. But what I'm curious about is, in doing so, in writing Chilean Poet, which among other things is very much about raising a boy, why at the same time that you yourself were becoming a father, your character is becoming a stepfather? and I have a theory. But before I give you my theory, I just want to hear what the impulse was to make the relationship one that is harder to define than father than son.
I would like to hear your theory, and I think it should be much better than mine. But I have to say that I've been interested in step parenthood for many years, and because of many reasons. But I think all contemporary discussions are in some way about legitimacy and belonging, and step parents deal with this problem all the time. It is such a special and challenging kind of relationship, and it's hard to explain the position of a stepfather or of a stepmother. You just fall in love with someone who already has a child, so you find yourself in an unexpected position, an ambiguous position. And then the relationship with the child will tend to grow, and you start wondering what is going to happen if your relationship with their biological parent ends. So I think you could explain adoptive parenthood very easily. I mean, there are abandoned childs, and someone takes care of them. So that's easy to understand. But what is in between? You are always dealing with this big question: what is going to happen? And you don't relate to kids to abandon them. So it is true. I wrote this novel, which is about Chile. And while I was living in Mexico, I started living in Mexico 5 years ago. And this novel has nothing to do with Mexico. Also, it is a novel I wrote while I was becoming a biological father, and it's about a different kind of fatherhood. So I think it was good, that movement from the little room I was writing and the apartment. I used to think in a different way about things I have just written, So I think your theory is better. Please tell me your theory.
Well, it might not be, I think it might be related, and maybe you can tell me whether you think it's related or whether it's different, and also whether it's wrong, of course. But it seems to me like one of the strong through lines that connects not only your fiction, but also your fiction and your nonfiction is the notion of secondary characters. That your parents' generation in Chile, their story, whether they were torturers or whether they were tortured, or whether they were the people who looked away, their story was worthy of novels. And your generation were the secondary characters within your parents' story. But we also see this show up in many different ways. You say that to pass literary exams in Chile, it is important to focus on learning about the secondary characters in books because there are always test questions about them. And your nonfiction literary criticism, it often focuses not on secondary writers necessarily, but certainly less iconic and well-known ones. You're not writing a lot on Neruda or Mistral or Raul Zurita, but more on this overshadowed secondary world, perhaps. And we definitely see these quote-unquote secondary poets a lot in your new book. But even when you write about someone well-known, say Bolaño, you write mostly about his lesser-known writings, his poetry. And even when you're doing literary criticism, say when you're writing about Natalia Ginsburg's book, Family Lexicon, you admire how she displaces the primary story, which is the story of a Jewish anti-fascist family that lives through horror and only partly survives it, with a secondary story, her love for the people, the grousing of the father, the mother's humor, the lost language of the community. And similarly, you've described the writing of your first book, Bonsai, in this way. I didn't want to write a novel, but rather the summary of a novel, a bonsai of a novel. Borges' advice was to write as if composing the summary of a book that was already written. That's what I did, or what I tried to do, summarize the secondary scenes of a non-existent book. So I guess I wonder if this position of your generation and this question of how to write literature from this position, one of secondary characters, if that might partially be behind the impulse to, in a way, make the father in Chilean Poet a secondary sort of father, to put him in a position of that questions his primacy in fatherhood.
Oh, I love your theory, and and I agree. I mean, my writing comes from exposure to poetry, basically. Even I think when I am put in the position of talking about this fiction, nonfiction discussion, uh, I think this is something I haven't thought about. I mean, because the relationship between poetry and fiction. I wouldn't say I know what the difference is. I was reading, for example, like 20 years ago, Robert Browning and Alfred Tennyson, uh, the dramatic monologue, for example, that creates a poetry that it is explicitly related to fiction, and and then I don't know, it's Rapound and even Chilean poets like Nicanor Parra are on that tradition, and they are dealing with this idea that poetry is confessional, which is a prejudice by many critics. I think big critics I love, like I don't know, Bakhtin, for example, Mikhail Bakhtin. Didn't like poetry because he thought it was like a confession, like a first person confession. I'm obviously simplifying his ideas, but for him, the novel was like the thing, the real thing, because it created a dialogue, a real dialogue that was really representing the world in its complexity. But all poetry, 20th century poetry, deals with that idea, and it is against the idea that a poem is like a confession. If you think about Fernando Pessoa, for example, just like a literal example of this. So I don't know what I was talking about. Sorry.
Well, let's take this hard to define relationship into the level of language, and specifically the Spanish language, because there's this great scene in the book when Gonzalo, the stepfather, and Vicente, the stepson, are in the grocery store and are sort of someone inquires who they are to each other, and clearly friend isn't the right answer, but neither is stepfather, because in Spanish it has a different connotation than in English or French. Like in English, it's kind of, I think, neutral, but in French, for instance, beau-père is beautiful father. But in Spanish, it's apparently quite, I don't know if nasty, but it seems like it has a real dark connotation to it.
It's a bad word. It's like an insult.
Yeah, talk to us about padrastro.
Yeah, I think that scene is where the novel started. I thought about that scene. Something slightly similar happened to me, and then I thought about this not having a name, not having a role, or having a role but not having a name, and I thought about this word padrastro. Actually, my second novel is also about that in a way. I mean, The Private Lives of Trees, the main character is a padrastro too, is a stepfather. But I haven't thought about this word that way until I thought about this complicated issue with naming, and there are many families where people don't use any word. It's like your name. I mean, he's Pablo, she's Marcela, and that's it. You avoid the word because in Spanish and in many languages, it is a bad word, pejorative. It's a word that even means something bad. bad father. One of the definitions of padrastro in Spanish is bad father, but it is the only word we have. So I was like, what does this mean? This prejudice? And as I was telling you, I think all discussions are about legitimacy, and parents are facing legitimacy. Stepfathers, padrastros, are facing this from the very beginning. Like they start the game losing it, and they have to do something with this word and decide whether to use it or not, or maybe to create a new word. So I was like, this is kind of the problem of the poet. Poets are dealing with words every day, and nobody seems to notice. They are dealing with the poem. They are deciding important things about each word of the poem. And this seems to be an invisible work. It's not that people would get that. I remember this beautiful speech by Wisława Szymborska, the Polish poet, who says like the worst movie is a movie about a poet writing, because she might write 2 lines and then erase them, and then would write 5 verses and would work many days with this 5 verses and would try to get to something. So she says like nobody is going to watch that movie, Yeah. and in a way that's why the poet and the padrastro and the stepfather became one character to me. Also the word poet, I think in English it also happens that it's more like it's not exactly, or it's not only a noun, it's an adjective too. It's like a poet. You are a poet. No? You are a poet of literature. that means you're good at it.
Right.
You are a poet of soccer. You are really good. You are inspired, and so there is something about the word poet that it is also related to legitimacy. If you happen to read a bad poem, you say, "Oh, this is not a poet." No, the person who wrote this is not a poet. So you are denying this person the condition of that scene that you mentioned. It's not the first scene of the novel, but in my head was the first one.
Yeah. Well, I think it's crucial to the book that he's also a poet struggling with language. I mean, is it true? Because there's a section of the book in English that's called Step Poet. And I'm guessing that in Spanish that must be poetrastro or poetastro.
We changed some of the titles. So in Spanish, here it is familiastra.
Okay.
Which is like a
step family.
Step family,
or bad, or
it's
bad
not
family.
The same, because as you said, it sounds normal in English.
Yeah.
Familiastra is a word that doesn't even exist. I use it in this novel a lot, but that word doesn't exist. Familiastra.
But it would suggest a bad family, possibly.
Like a family-ish or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. But Megan found this great solution, what's exactly the title she used?
I think she used Step Poet.
Oh, Step Poet.
Yeah,
Step Poet.
But it's interesting that padrastro can mean bad father. It can mean obstruction or impediment, and it can mean hangnail, which I thought was hilarious. But that the suffix you can use for, like you used for familia, you can use the suffix as a negative connotation on something. But when you talk about Gonzalo, our padrastro and poet, and he's somebody who's an aspiring poet, he's obviously struggling to find language to create art, and at the same time struggling to find language to understand his relationship with his stepson. There's the difficulty of understanding your relationship to your stepson while you're with the mother, because especially not just because there isn't language or there isn't friendly language, but also there's no traditions. There's no cultural tradition or lineage of padrastros to use as the way to be one. But it's even more difficult if all of a sudden you are no longer with the mother of the son. And so he's struggling in two ways around language, but one of the ways he's struggling around constructing a sense of self and belonging and legitimacy is being a poet within the poetry world, because he has a very common name. And so he decides he's going to find a pseudonym, which has a long tradition in Chilean poetry. He wants to find a pseudonym that will give him legitimacy and place and belonging and language to it. So I was hoping maybe we could hear that part of the book, which to me is very endearing and self-deprecating and funny in a way that I think really captures the tone of a lot of the book overall. So we'll have you read it in Spanish, and then we'll get Megan to read it in English.
Oh, that's great. Okay. La idea de adoptar un seudónimo le sonaba cursilona y desagradable, pero se sentía obligado, porque aunque solo había leído unos poemas sueltos de Gonzalo Rojas, que encontró magníficos por lo demás, estaba al tanto de que era uno de los poetas chilenos más reconocidos en el mundo. De hecho, acababa de ganar el Premio Nacional de Literatura y otro premio parece que bien importante en España. El nombre estaba entonces ocupado y la opción de usar el apellido de su madre, Muñoz, tampoco servía, porque había otro poeta, harto menos conocido que Gonzalo Rojas, pero bendecido por una misteriosa aura vanguardista, llamado Gonzalo Muñoz. La posibilidad de firmar como Gonzalo Rojas Muñoz, en tanto, le sonaba demasiado a no soy ese Gonzalo Rojas. Era como admitir de antemano la derrota. Intentó seguir el modelo de Pablo de Roca, nacido Carlos Díaz Loyola, que había inventado un apellido que significaba algo por sí mismo, pero se le ocurrían puras payasadas como Gonzalo de Rota o Gonzalo de Más o Gonzalo de Rape, que igual le gustaba un poco. Se inclinó entonces por buscar un seudónimo en otros ecosistemas literarios, tal como en su momento hicieron Gabriela Mistral y Pablo Neruda, ganadores del Premio Nobel, al fin y al cabo. Tras descartar las opciones más necias, Gonzalo Rimbaud, Gonzalo Ginsberg, Gonzalo Pasolini, Gonzalo Pizarnik, consolidó una lista corta con los seudónimos Gonzalo García Lorca, Gonzalo Corso, Gonzalo Gras, Gonzalo Lipo y Gonzalo Lee Masters, pero no consiguió decidirse por ninguno. Ya caía la noche cuando se le ocurrió el seudónimo Gonzalo Pessoa, que le permitía homenajear simultáneamente al poeta portugués Fernando Pessoa, a quien no había leído pero sabía que era genial, y al poeta chileno Carlos Pessoa Vélez, que le gustaba mucho.
The idea of adopting a pseudonym was cheesy and unpleasant, but he felt obligated to do it, because although he had only read a few random poems by Gonzalo Rojas, and found them magnificent, it must be said, he was aware that the man was one of the most renowned Chilean poets in the world, and in fact had just won the National Prize for Literature, plus another prize that was apparently very important in Spain. His name, then, was already taken, and the option of using his mother's last name, Muñoz, wouldn't work either, because there was another poet, much less well known than Gonzalo Rojas, but blessed with an aura of vanguard and mystery, named Gonzalo Muñoz, And the option of signing his name as Gonzalo Rojas Munoz, he thought, would be like saying, not that Gonzalo Rojas. It was like admitting defeat from the get-go. He considered following the example of Pablo de Roca, born Carlos Diaz Loyola, who had invented a last name that meant something on its own. But he could only come up with inanities like Gonzalo de Ville, or Gonzalo de Port, or Gonzalo de Claim, which he did like a little. Then he turned toward the option of finding a pseudonym in other literary ecosystems, as Gabriela Mistral and Pablo Neruda had done. After all, both had won the Nobel Prize. After ruling out the silliest options, Gonzalo Rimbaud, Gonzalo Ginsberg, Gonzalo Pasolini, Gonzalo Pizarnik, he consolidated a short list with the names Gonzalo Garcia Lorca, Gonzalo Corso, Gonzalo Gras, Gonzalo Lee Po, and Gonzalo Lee Masters. But he couldn't decide on any one of them. Night was already falling when he thought of the pseudonym Gonzalo Pessoa, which would allow him to pay homage simultaneously to the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, who he hadn't read but knew was great, and the Chilean poet Carlos Pessoa Vélez, who he liked a lot.
We've been listening to Alejandro Zambra and Megan McDowell read from Chilean Poet. I love that section. And I want to touch on English a little bit. Since we're talking about pseudonyms, we're talking about you as a person when you are speaking English. And you said that when you've had to read in English the words of Megan, your translator and your friend, that reading them has felt like acting or imitating. Totally. Sometimes you'd forget while you were reading that it was your book. And that sometimes when you would encounter people who didn't speak Spanish but loved your books, presumably in English or other languages, that you were really Megan's front man, that your name was on a book of Megan's book. But I wanted to take this idea of this notion of secondary characters into this realm, where you characterize yourself as Megan's front man, not the reverse. Because you wrote this wonderful piece for a chapbook called A Table Made Again for the First Time on Kate Briggs's This Little Art, a work by Kate Briggs, which is a meditation on translation.
A great book.
I love that book too. Yeah. And your piece in there is called Translating a Person. And of course, I read Megan's translation of that piece, which is in there. And it's about your history with this secondary language of yours, English. I'm presuming it's your secondary language and maybe not your tertiary or language. But we learn about the gringo in your high school, how your English teacher laughed at you when you used the word alimentation. When you used the word alimentation. But the gringo later showed you in the dictionary that the word actually exists, that your English teacher who made fun of you was actually incorrect. But you also then talk about how English is sort of a patchwork of stolen phrases for you, and often phrases that you've discovered in writing. So maybe you would see the word alimentation, even though most English speakers wouldn't use it commonly, but you would find these phrases in poetry and prose, maybe even more than spoken English. And I love that your friends used the phrase speaking English as the phrase for getting drunk, which is great. Or that you yourself tried to improve your English by translating Emily Dickinson. But what's most interesting, I guess, when we come back to Gonzalo and his trying to figure out these various possibilities for pseudonyms to join the poetry community under this other name, is that you said when you were living and working in New York at the New York Public Library that you realized that you could communicate just fine if you accepted that you could never use your favorite words, that you couldn't play with tone with any meaningful facility, you couldn't crack jokes in a way that felt natural, and ultimately this was a chance to simply be a different person in English. And I wondered if that was similar to how Gonzalo might feel, if these are connected. This question of like, what sort of person will Gonzalo invent becoming a stepfather, which has no rules? And similarly, what name of the many hilarious names he's considering is he going to put himself forward with his fellow poets as the name that will sort of define him as this alternate persona within that world?
Well, there are many things you just said that I would like to comment, but I don't want to forget to mention how grateful and happy I am due to this campaign, like translators on the cover. Translators' name are now in the right place, I think, and I'm very happy because this book has Megan's name for the first time on the cover, and it's really the way it has to be, I think. And yes, when I was living in New York, I sometimes I got invited to readings, and they expected me to read in English, obviously. So I was like calling Megan, who was in Chile, and asking her, please, would you read this? Would you record this? And then I was listening to it and imitating her directly, because it's not really the same, obviously, talking, than reading aloud a piece that has its own sense of rhythm. When you read aloud, obviously you have to control or have an idea about the vowels that are really different, and there are many mistakes that you don't want to happen. But at the same time, it was more. Megan, when she translates, she gets a sense of rhythm that I get and that I love, and I wouldn't say that it's different than my sense of rhythm. I mean, it's really similar, but I don't know how to say it. But she's playing her own music, and it was amazing. Like hearing this, listening to this. It flows in a very beautiful way, and I was imitating it. I mean, I was supposed to be the one who wrote that, but I was directly imitating the way she read her own writing, I think, and it's really interesting. Things related to translation are really interesting, and that essay was a lot about speaking a language you don't really know. You know, I mean, I know Spanish. I think we have this amazing language that is spoken in many ways, in many different ways. But we get to understand each other the whole time. I mean, the way we speak in Chile is different than the way they speak in Argentina or in Peru. I mean, and you can find small, beautiful, meaningful differences between the way we speak. So you are learning a lot inside a language. The same language, and if you go to Spain, there are many differences, and you feel them stronger, and maybe you deal with communication a little bit, but you still get to understand the other person. What we use many words that have different meanings, but you only get to understand those meanings when some little crisis or when some problem comes up, and it's really funny. And at the same time, we read each other, and we see those differences written in a short story, in a novel. So we are always like kind of translating ourselves, and I really love that about the Spanish. And with English, well, I've been reading English for a long time, but it's really different when I have to talk, when I have to speak in front of an audience, when I have to speak like now, and I know I am being recorded. Many people in Chile and I think in Latin America never really studied English, but we kind of got it by listening to music, basically that, and movies, but basically music, and sometimes we were really enjoying songs that we didn't know what they were about, So it's very, it's not like I like the Billie Jean example, it's a really terrible song if you pay attention to the lyrics. It's a very stupid song too, but we were dancing it, and we were enjoying it. So I think this novel is also a little bit about translation, and there is this character Prue who goes to Chile, and there is a big mistake, so she doesn't get to the place she's supposed to get, and then she comes across these poets, and randomly she happens to be writing an article about the Chilean poetry, but she's not really into poetry, and she's not really into Chilean poetry, and she speaks Spanish. She does speak Spanish, but not the Spanish she would have to speak and to understand to get to read a poem, which is obviously one of the most hard things to. This is when you mentioned the translating Emily Dickinson in order to improve my English, I think people would say, like, what's this about? I mean, it's really stupid. It's like it's really hard to read Emily Dickinson. Yeah. But the thing is that we were reading Emily Dickinson in this bilingual editions that were printed in Spain, and those translations were done thinking of Spanish readers, Spaniards. But those were the same books we were reading in Chile. So we had the poem in English and the poem in Spanish, and we didn't really like those translations, or we did like them, but they were different than the way we would face them. So we started like this is really stupid, but we started like correcting them without really knowing English. So, but we started correcting them like using the language of poetry, I would say, like, or trying to imagine what Emily Dickinson would have liked, would have felt, and that's how we improved.
I love that.
Our English. I think this is a very good example of failure, because now I'm speaking this terrible English. But this is why I don't know. Sometimes I used certain words that were not common, and sometimes I ignore very usual words. So my English was kind of weird.
Well, let's stay with failure and translation and language a little longer, because when you spoke in Belgium, I learned from your interviewer there that the Dutch translation of the book is Almost a Father. And that interviewer was suggesting that maybe that was a better title, Almost a Father. And you said definitely not a better title. And I want to go into the title that you do have, but for now I want to talk about a secondary title that you considered, which I think connects us to what we are talking about. You said that one of the titles you had in mind was, in English, The Repeaters,
Yes.
which is a reference to repeating a grade when you have failed academically. But repeating feels like something very important in your work to me, both formally and thematically as a whole. And also I think The Repeaters could also be something about translation too, with the repeated book. For one, Carla and Gonzalo, the couple, they're together when they're young, then they're apart for many years, and then they're together again. Now she has a child. And so Gonzalo is confronted with becoming a padrastro. But then Gonzalo and Vicente, his stepson, they're together. And then when that relationship with Carla falls apart, they're apart. And then later on in the book, they repeat. They come back together. And even more probably strikingly, I think, formally speaking, we see this in Ways of Going Home. This narrative doubling, leaving and returning, or how in The Private Lives of Trees, a writer tells his stepdaughter a bedtime story that itself is called The Private Life of Trees. And the writer is writing a book about bonsai trees, just like you had just written and published. You were on this panel for the National Book Foundation that was supposed to be about Juan Rulfo.
Oh, yeah.
But because his family had trademarked his name, I thought this was so strange. Because his family had trademarked his name, it had to be about something else. So they changed the name, even though you had all agreed to come together to talk about Rulfo's work. And it became about the role of time. And Cristina Rivera Garza, she talked about not wanting to bring readers back to the past, but instead to bring the past forward, which feels to her like what Rulfo does in Pedro Páramo. And you talked about how the word for time and the word for weather, tiempo, are the same word in Spanish. So for me, this idea of repetition, of this doubling back of time, or the repeaters, it feels like it's the weather of your work somehow, this way you have with repetition. And I guess I want to hear more about leaving and returning, or double narratives, or maybe an argument for why The Repeaters is a good title or a bad title for Chilean Poet.
Can you repeat your question? I'm joking. But I really like your theories. And I think repetition is a way of feeling alive. I mean, when you make the same mistake again, I think you learn. It's important. Things happen twice or three times, and when they try to make a movie out of a novel, they are always like simplifying, because I don't know. I remember this very good example with Madame Bovary. Okay, if you want to make a movie, well, Charles Bovary gets married twice, but and they live in in two small cities. So you might simplify, and you might lose what repetition creates inside you. That maybe strong, but at the same time, I don't know how to say this because it's really complicated, even in Spanish. But how you deal with the idea of having an identity, you know? I don't think identities should be defined, but at the same time, I really like identity to be discussed over and over. I think when you say like I'm here, I'm this person, and I belong to these people. Okay, that's beautiful. I love that. But you cannot stop there. You should go beyond that, and you should like really think about what it means to have that certainty. And maybe that would make you feel even more happy, and that would make you to feel that you can struggle, and that you can fight, and that everything's going to be all right. I'm not saying that this dealing with identity would mean a perpetual crisis. You know, it's not about that. I mean, it's about the moment when I don't know, self-criticism. I think it is so important, and in many levels. And obviously, self-criticism could be a problem too, and could make you feel stuck or feel bad. But in a way, it is always an opportunity, and I really believe that. I mean, not in literature, in life. I mean, it's important to have that window where you can really see yourself from a certain distance, and to make that distance a sign of love, you know. I'm not saying it really well, but do get the idea.
No, I do. I feel like the moments of self-criticism within your books are often also the moments of humor and the moments of love. But I want to stay with this question of distance, because you mentioned you wrote this book in Mexico, and it takes place in Chile, and very much is about, you could call it a critically loving and humorous homage to the Chilean poetry scene and other things. But I suspect being in Mexico, imagining that you're raising a child who primarily speaks Mexican Spanish, though I'm guessing he also speaks Chilean Spanish also, of course, but within an ecosystem of Mexican Spanish. I think about something that you wrote about Chilean poet Enrique Lin, where you talk about his life, which was spent mostly abroad in Mexico and Spain, or at least largely abroad in Mexico and Spain. And you say his poetry does not have the accent of those places. You say, quote, "He makes one think of an imaginary country called Chile, one that rather than stripping away nationality, produces negatives of Chileans, absences of Chileans." And I was curious what the effect of writing from distance has had on your writing. If it doesn't have the accent of Mexico on it, has it allowed you to see certain things about Chile that maybe you wouldn't have seen if you wrote it in Santiago?
Yeah, I think so. I have to say that I always like it. I always hated the cliche of you have to go somewhere else to really see your country. You know, I always hated it. Maybe because it was, I don't know, like a snob position, you know. You have to go somewhere else, maybe New York, in order to really see your. I don't think that. I mean, it's not that you have to get a physical distance in order to write about something. But there is something related to language that I really care about. Maybe this is a contradiction, but well, when I was living in New York, for example, my Chilean speech stayed the same, because I was always switching, and I didn't feel like I was like mixing those languages. I mean, it was naturally related to the kind of experience I was going through. I mean, I was talking to native speakers the whole day, and I went home and I was feeling my Spanish language, and I was enjoying it while talking to friends. But there wasn't a really like a conflict there. But living in Mexico is totally different, because I married a Mexican woman, and my kid does speak Mexican. I think really he speaks Mexican, although he sometimes translates himself for me, you know, like having a toast and oh, I really like this aguacate, avocado, this aguacate. And then he looks at me and says, palta, dad, palta. It's like he's playing, because he knows I know, but he plays with words a lot. But his accent is totally Mexican, and I would say like he sounds more Mexican than any other Mexican I have ever heard. You know? So, and at the same time, every day there is some little problem related to communication, and some of them are really specific. You know, I don't know if I'm able to put an example, but well, I can try. You know, for example, if you ask for using the toilet in Chilean Spanish, you would say like, puedo ocupar el baño. You would use the verb ocupar, occupy. You know, but in other places, that sounds weird. It sounds like you want to go to the bathroom and stay there and put your flag, or Chilean flag, and stay there and forever, you know? So yes. Only when you are...
In English, it would sound weird too. I occupy the bathroom.
Yeah, yeah.
It's strange.
So only when you are in a foreign country and you use your normal words and you realize that there is something blurred or some sort of different reaction, you would get those kind of differences. That, I mean, there are many examples. So this kind of problems, I mean, every day I have a new one, and I love that.
Yeah.
You know, because, well, I'm 46 years old, and I really like having new problems, you know. It's like dealing with language, and obviously with accent. My Spanish, I think it sounds really Chilean for a Spanish reader. And everywhere it sounds Chilean. And there are things about the Chilean speech I love a lot. And now I think I'm I'm getting not a Mexican accent, but a different position towards certain words and certain rhythms that are really interesting to me, because they became natural. It's not that I'm speaking in a different way exactly, but I don't know. This is a lot about words, about loving words and dealing with them and hating them and discovering them. So this has been really amazing. And well, about this novel, are we talking about this novel? I think there was some sort of homesickness. When I started living here, it was really a decision. I met Jasmina in New York. She was studying there. I was working in the Kalman Center, and we had to come back to our countries, and we discussed where to live. We wanted to have a kid, and we discussed that in a very practical way. So there's no like professional reason for being here, for staying in Mexico City. In that sense, writers sometimes are really portable. You know, like I could be here, I could be there. I was lucky to have those opportunities, and we decided to be here for many reasons. But when that really happened, when we started living here, I started feeling this homesickness, and I thought, what kind of Chilean am I going to become? You know, what kind of Chilean not living in Chile am I going to become? And there are some kinds of Chilean living outside Chile that I hated, you know, and so I felt like the danger of becoming someone I hate.
Yeah.
I think that works for everything, like for teaching, for writing. I mean, there is a moment where you realize that you are about to become the writer you hate, the teacher you hate, the person you hate.
Yeah.
So I was like I really need to make something good out of this, to stay with homesickness, but to put it a different sign. And I think my way of doing that was writing this novel. I mean, it's a novel that I had a great time writing this novel. I mean, obviously, it was. This is related to becoming a father, and I was just doing those two things, like being a writer and being a father. I think in the first place I was being a father, and then I was being a writer, and I wasn't. I mean, I wasn't writing for articles, and I wasn't teaching, so I was fully dedicated to my kid and my novel, and I did want this to be like music. I was able to hear and dance at the same time. So it was really a beautiful and joyful experience. I mean, writing is always joyful, I think, but sometimes as we deal with things, and we I mean, this is a sad novel, but also I think it contains, in a way, this happiness, you know, of flowing, of speaking and hearing Chilean speech alive. So I would say that I wanted this homesickness to become playful and interesting. I mean, it's not interesting to be just there, like feeling that your country is away and that you miss people. I obviously miss many people, but this was my way of dealing with it. And then the pandemic happened. So, well, that's another chapter, because I published this novel in Spanish right when the pandemic started. I mean, the book was on bookstores exactly the day bookstores were closed.
Well, let me ask you one more question about just distance before we go more deeply into the novel again. But
even deeper.
I want to,
wow.
Yeah, no, I want to go deeper. I'm perhaps talking about my favorite scene in the book. But before we do, there's a multiple choice question in multiple choice where the options are: 1, a curfew is a regulation prohibiting free circulation in public within a determined area. 2, it tends to be decreed in times of war or popular uprising. 3, the dictatorship imposed one in Santiago, Chile from September 11th, 1973 until January 2nd, 1987. 4, one summer evening, my father went out walking with no destination in mind. It grew late, and he had to sleep at a friend's house. 5, they made love. She got pregnant. I was born. And whether this is literally true or not, your writing definitely operates in the shadow of the dictatorship, and also how your generation came of age during its fall, but how the freedom that was triumphed in its wake felt to you like a fake freedom, that many of the mechanisms of the fascist state were still operating after the so-called dictatorship had ended. It just made me wonder how it felt watching the election of Boric from Mexico, the election of a genuine left-wing young candidate in Chile was like. How are you feeling about it, pro or con? But it seems like perhaps a bigger shift politically in Chile than what you've had in your life up until now.
Definitely. I'm so happy about this. I mean, for many, many, many reasons, in this novel, this novel ends like in 2014, like March 2014. And by then there was this hope that was growing, but at the same time, many people were discussing whether this hope was true or not. And that hope was related to what happened 3 years before with the students and these new leaders. And Gabriel Boric was one of those leaders. I think his name is printed in this novel, I think. Because I captured that discussion about these new leaders, and Vicente's father obviously thinks that they are the same and nothing is going to change, and he doesn't he's not interested in what is going on. And Vicente, he wants this to happen, and at the same time he distrusts. He's not believing, and at the same time he is believing, and he wants to believe in, and he doesn't trust the system, but he trusts these new leaders that are a little older than he is. I mean, I really liked that moment because of that, because hope was there, but not in a naive way. It was like true hope, because it dealt with its own legitimacy. And obviously there are many discussions about trust. So, well, what can I say? I am really happy about what's going on in my country. It's a new generation. I just wrote a piece about this, like a brother, your younger brother, a younger brother. I think I feel that. I mean, a younger brother who this generation is like a younger brother who really killed the father, but at the same time they are trying to I wouldn't say like resuscitate them, the generation of the fathers, but it is like that. It is an opportunity to really get a dialogue and get something valuable, important. I'm really happy about what's going on in my country because of the election of Gabriel Boric, and also because a new constitution is being discussed.
Yes.
And many causes that seemed very, very invisible when I was 18 years old, for example, are now becoming real. And that's so beautiful, and it's such a big challenge. Obviously, this is going to be really hard. But I really like, I personally like Gabriel Boric because he is always speaking with a plural first person. I know I'm not saying it well, but
no, that's great.
It's always with the us, not with the me. And a president seems to be like one person, and the authority he's supposed to construct is like immanent, but he's sharing that, and I think he's going to do that. I mean, to create a more plural sense of power, to reformulate power. I'm really looking forward to this new government. Also, he's a poet. I don't know whether you yeah, he's a poet, and he said, what's the word you use in English? Frustrated? You say frustrated? No.
You could say he's a frustrated poet.
You say he's a frustrated poet, and I said, like, okay, that's fine, because we are all frustrated presidents, So, but he writes poetry. He's a very good reader.
Yeah.
He reads novels and poetry. So he understands what our job consists on.
I also feel like the way you're speaking about him around the first person plural, it connects to something about your writing too, like the way Gonzalo and Vicente, sort of the way they construct their own senses of self are sort of dependent on the other, or the way Gonzalo in the poetry community is only able to construct who he is through his engagement with the others within it. Like there is very much a sense of sort of a self coming through conversation. I want to take this and just bring this back to one of my favorite parts of Chilean Poet. But first I want to just speak to the very last piece in your nonfiction collection, No Layer. It's a speech you gave in 2016, which you framed as a return. So we could say it's another example of repeating, because it was a homecoming, because you were invited to give a speech at the department of the university where you had taught for many years. And the final paragraph of this speech, which is also the final paragraph of this entire book, goes, quote, "They say that there are only 3 or 4 or 5 topics of literature, but maybe there's only one, belonging. Perhaps all books can be read as a function of the desire to belong, or the negation of that desire, to be a part of or stop being part of a family, of a community, a country, of Chilean literature, a football team, a political party, a rock band, or at least a group of scouts. That's what we write about when we're given a free topic. and also when we are writing about love, death, travel, telegrams, or suitcases with swivel wheels. That's what we always talk about, seriously and in jest, in verse and in prose, belonging. And I love this, but I also love that you don't just suggest that belonging or not belonging is the topic of literature, but you also write about a lot about books as objects that become part of our creation of self or of self-belonging. You have essays about the impulse to collect books, about the disappointment when you go to a new friend's house and you see the books that are on their bookshelf, about the rituals that you've developed about traveling with books and which books you're going to travel with and how that looks. And I bring this all up, your thoughts on belonging as literature's singular theme and books as almost amulets or talisman themselves in the question to belong or the question of how to define oneself against. Because one of my favorite parts of Chilean Poet occurs in the middle, and it serves as a sort of hinge, I think. It's when Carla and Gonzalo, they split up, and all of a sudden Gonzalo, who one day to the next has suddenly disappeared from his stepson's life. So he's not going to have the same access to the inner workings of the relationship of his mother. So it appears much more suddenly to him. And the way that he grapples with who Gonzalo was to him and what his absence means is by grappling with his empty bookshelves. So he tries many things. He removes them entirely from the walls. He then reinstalls them and fills them randomly with books that have no special significance to Vicente as one way to perhaps exercise Gonzalo. And then he fills the bookshelves with books that he loves. And then he also meditates on the few books that Gonzalo has left behind. What are those books? Why are those the books that didn't go with him? And you've quoted Adam Phillips before, who said, to translate a person is to translate a text that doesn't exist. And in this spirit, I'd love to hear you talk about the way Vicente grieves or expresses anger or expresses love, and the way he sort of defines himself against Gonzalo or with Gonzalo through bookshelves, through books as objects that surround you when you're in a room.
Yeah, I mean, you touched like the center of the novel in my view, which is not important. It's not important what I think about the novel, you know. But I am pleased that you chose that part because in a way that's the real question. I mean, we could talk about this and think about the stepfather, the padrastro, but it is even more important what is happening inside the boy, because maybe the stepfather in a way knew that something like this could happen, but the kid, well, maybe he also suspects that this painful thing could happen, but his position is really difficult, because in a way he gets that if Carla and Gonzalo split up, his mother might be sad, and the mother is the main character there, and he's again the secondary character of that story, but at the same time he has feelings. He was raised by Gonzalo and not by his father, who is an asshole, whose only merit is to be there. I mean, he's there, but he's not there. And Gonzalo was there. Gonzalo was a good father, even though it's hard to know what it means to be a good father, but he was raising him, and he has this idea of Gonzalo writing and reading a lot, but that wasn't really important to Vicente. I mean, in this sense, I think the whole novel is obviously about poets, but it's not clear that they are really poets. You know, I think I was more interested in the way poets deal with everyday life and with problems that are there for everyone. It's not that special being a poet, and part of its energy is related to that. You know, poets are not in a different place, are sharing life, and they are dealing with communities, and maybe they have a different job, a job that they don't necessarily like, or maybe they do like those jobs, but they are poets, but that they have to be something else, because the world doesn't seem to like poets or to respect them. So I was a lot interested in trying to define. I know this is really ambitious, but trying to define a literary vocation. And in this moment, Vicente is dealing with this empty place. He misses those books, even though he didn't like those books. I mean, and he gets, okay, he left. So the bookshelves are now empty because all books were his books. So it's natural. So in a way, he gets that, but it is disappointing to get in that room and to see this emptiness. So as you mentioned, he tries things and he deals with pain, but not necessarily he is aware of that pain the whole time, or maybe he feels that that pain it's more his mom's pain and not his. And so I really like the moment where he discovers these two books, one book by Gonzalo Millán, another book by Emily Dickinson, and he opens them and reads them and doesn't like them. He doesn't understand what is that about, and a little later, some years later, he is more. He opens the book again and finds something, and it's not that he really thinks I got this, but he doesn't understand, but he likes that disconcert, and he specifically reads a poem by Gonzalo Millán about a pea, arveja, it's in Spanish, or in Mexico it's like a chicharo, a pea, you know, a little pea in the refrigerator, a lonely pea in the refrigerator, and the poem is about that. The poem by Gonzalo Millán is about that. It's a real poem about a pea, a lonely pea in the refrigerator. And he's like, I've seen that pea, you know? It's incredible that the job of this person consists in finding those images I have seen and nobody gives a shit about. And I like this idea of someone that is focused in supposedly unimportant things, and he or she collects them and writes poem, and that's how he enters poetry. And I think in the life of every poet, there is a moment where you face your own misunderstanding and find some beauty in the position. And at the same time, I think this is obviously more easy to explain when you think about music, because I think poetry is basically bad taught, badly taught. I mean, it's hard to, obviously it's hard to teach poetry, but I don't know, you even from the very beginning, you get a sense of music. When you're born, you feel music, and music is around, and there are different kinds of music and styles, and you enjoy some of it. And your mother is singing, and your father is also singing and playing the guitar, and they like different kinds of music. So you get a whole sense of what music is, without needing music to be defined. And that's so beautiful, that you really position yourself, and you feel that you know a lot about music, but that was never explained to you. And I would like to that the same thing would happen with poetry, that you would feel those poems and many kinds of poems, and you would decide whether you like this or that. But it seems that the system is more trying to define and to control in taste. That's really, can I say bad words in your show?
Yeah, say as many as
that's
you
really fucked up. I mean, I mean, like you are told, like, well, when you are 7 years old, I know there are many exceptions, but I'm thinking about those moments where you are told, like, this is poetry. Well, I know it sounds a lot like Dead Poet Society, but I hated that movie, but I think I really like it, and I hated myself liking it,
That's very well said.
But there is something about, I mean, even jokes, for example, jokes. When a kid learns to tell jokes, he learned everything he needs to know. He knows everything he needs. I mean, it's really hard to tell a joke, and it is a story, and it is fiction, and you can analyze it, and you have many different kinds of jokes, and it's really a beautiful process. But at first, you just like the situation of someone telling a story, and the reaction to that story, which is laughing.
Yeah.
And as a kid, you feel, okay, this is great. So I'm gonna say something, I'm gonna tell a story, and people will laugh. And so kids imitate that, but they don't really tell a joke. They tell a story, and they expect a result, and people laugh about that effort. And it's really interesting. Like, I mean, stupid parents would say, this is not a joke, this is not the proper way of telling a joke. But normal people would react to that. And so you told a story, and people reacted laughing, but it's not a legitimate laugh.
Yeah.
And you get to understand that later. So they are not laughing the same way they laugh when my dad tells a joke. There is a difference. So they start like practicing and creating their own sense of humor. It's so beautiful. And there is this terrible moment when you learn that you cannot tell the same joke over and over, to the same person. So you start playing with that form, and maybe you create another joke, or you work with style. I mean, it's so many sophisticated things you learn by telling a joke. And then you go to school, and the teacher tells you, okay, you are good at telling jokes. This is not important. We are going to study literature, poetry, and everything you know. It's not important now, because you are going to start learning right now. And it's terrible, because by then you really know many things, and school is rejecting those knowledge. This knowledge, what do I do with this? So I'm sorry, I got
no, it's okay,
but with the flow. But
let me connect this to something that I think might be, I don't think it would be lost in translation, but I think it's different between Chile and the United States. Like, for instance, I was just listening to a talk by Daniel Mendelsohn, the memoirist, classicist in the United States, who says that he thinks that the novel is still considered the pinnacle of literary achievement in the United States. It's something he's trying to dethrone, the novel, but he feels like that's the form that gets the most respect in the U.S. But that's not the case in Chile. And I wanted to talk about that, maybe in relationship to humor, but also overall too, because in your conversation with Daniel Alarcón, you said the following: there's a paradox. When I started writing prose, it was like a game. My poetry was very serious. Chile has a great tradition of poetry. Maybe I felt like I needed to write something transcendent. I enjoyed myself more when writing fiction, in part because I had less respect for it than for poetry. And one of the great things that I love about your prose is the way you lovingly poke fun at your characters. And by extension, it feels like you're poking fun at yourself. And also the way you poke fun at the poetry community. And there's just so much comedy. And the many sex scenes in this book are incredibly funny and also emotionally moving, and they really deepen our sense of the characters. And I guess I'm wondering, does that mean that we wouldn't find comedy and sex in your poetry because unlike the United States, poetry is the place of true writing in Chile?
That is the world I belong to. I mean, I write novels, but many of my friends are poets, and many of the most exciting and meaningful experiences as a reader I have had are related to poetry, specifically to Chilean poetry. I feel that the community related to me every time. I mean, I feel that it's not something I think. I'm always reading the poems by my friends are writing, and they, even though I've been away from publishing poetry for a long while, they are generous enough to consider me a poet still, even though I did this stupid thing about the stupid thing of writing novels. You know? I mean, I'm playing with that idea. The whole novel, Chilean Poet, is a novel, I think, with characters that wouldn't read that book. I mean, my characters are that they don't read novels, you know, so they're not going to read the book I wrote about them. But and this discussion between poetry and prose, it's interesting because it's interesting to talk about, I don't know, soccer or I don't know, music. I mean, it's not that serious, I think. although I do think there is a difference between poetry and novels or short stories. I mean, related to time, I mean, to use, the way you use poetry, or it's different than the way you use in a novel, you know? Long novels, longer than mine. I mean, the idea of reading a long novel, it's a period. It's like 2 weeks, like a month, a whole month reading a novel. I love that experience. And maybe you are not going to reread that novel again, but I really like that. And I also like reading a novella, a short book that it is a novel. It is longer than a short story, and you know that you are going to go through it in one sitting, in one afternoon, and it's really a joyful expectative, a joyful feeling that you are going to be there reading that book and you are going to finish it. And poetry is more related to me to the sacred. I mean, to I don't know how to say it, but it's related to religion. In a very unreligious way. I don't know how to say it. I mean, it's related to the sacred. Yeah. Maybe I can say it this way. For the last 25 years, there has been a book by Emily Dickinson and a book by Cesar Vallejo and a book by Gonzalo Millán on my nightstand. And I know that I will never get to the sensation I'm over it. I would never get to the sensation of I read this, you know?
Yeah.
I'm just reading them the same way other people are praying, you know?
Well, it goes back to music and also to
music,
repeating, because you never, with a good song, you're always returning to the song.
I would be more with the idea that defining literary genres, I'm not against the idea of defining literary genres, but it's a game, you know, and maybe we can get into that game with if we focus on the idea of repetition, for example. I mean, a long novel probably not relates to repetition the same way and a poem does, and the parallel with music is obviously very accurate, because I don't know if you listen the new song by Caetano Veloso for the first time, this new song in the middle of it, in the middle of the first time you're listening to it, you feel I like this, and that means I'm going to listen to this over and over. And that sense of future repetition, it's related to pleasure, you know? It would be really stupid that someone would say like, I really like this song by Caetano Veloso. I will never listen to it again because I already know I like this song, so I don't need to know. Music is related to repetition, and you would get a sense of the lyrics, and you would get and you would put your headphones, and you would experience it in a different way, and you would obviously play with the drums and dancing. I mean, this is really a good parallel, I think, and because the same thing happens with poetry. I mean, you read the poem by Emily Dickinson, and you don't really get to the sense that experience is going to be over. I mean, it's there. So I think for many people, literature is related to religion. And maybe we are atheists, or we don't really believe the way other people believe. But there is something about poetry that is related to some sort of idea of the sacred, and so I don't really remember what we were. But you asked me something.
Let me complicate it further, because you do. I love how you I think very provocatively confuse and break down the boundaries between genres. So there's this point. There are only a couple rare points in Chilean Poet when a first-person narrator appears. One of the times it goes, Vicente is a Chilean poet, and I am a Chilean novelist, and we Chilean novelists write novels about Chilean poets. And I wanted to take this into just some of the wonderful things you've written with regards to the novel and poetry. With Alarcón, you said that your community, as you've said, is largely the poetry community, that your friends, like your characters in this book, rarely read fiction, and they see novel as an exaggeration. And you quoted Chico Molina, who said, La novela es la poesía de los tontos. Novels are like poetry for idiots. But in No Leer, you say, in contrast, that good novels are closer to poetry than bad poems. So I love that good novels are closer to poetry than bad poems. And I also love, from your essay on Bolaño's poetry, this following quote, which you start with talking about one of his characters from 2666. Benno van Archibaldi thought that all poetry was or could be contained in a novel. Roberto Bolaño thought that the best poetry of the 20th century had been written in the form of a novel. James Joyce's Ulysses contains Eliot's The Wasteland, and Ulysses is better than Eliot's The Wasteland, he said in an interview. In 2002, he published Antwerp, a book of poetry, or something like a script for a book of poetry, or a script written after reading a book of poetry. In any case, he took the liberty of presenting it as a novel, or as he put it, the only novel I'm not ashamed of, maybe because it's unintelligible. And later you say, Bolaño's work tells the story of a poet resigned to being a novelist, a poet who descends to prose in order to write poetry. I just love that. And I also am curious, I guess, in light of that, about the actual poems that are in Chilean Poet. Are you simply dropping poems that you've written, Zambra-esque poems, or are you writing poems as Gonzalo and then putting them into the book? Like, how does the poetry that we find in Chilean Poet, purportedly written by your characters, but also written by a novelist who is a poet, is there the persona of character in the writing of these poems?
Writing those poems was my way of understanding those characters. So it was more like, oh, I have to write his poems, and like an assignment. And I wrote many poems, and it was really interesting because it wasn't my sense of poetry, and some of them are bad poems. Well, that's the risk. Some people would find the supposedly bad poems good poems, and the supposedly good poems bad poems. It's part of the risk. It was I think 2 weeks where I stopped writing a novel, and I was like, I want to write their poems, Vicente's and Gonzalo's poems, in order to get to know them. And there is this beautiful moment where characters are really beginning to be different than you, and that distance is related to I don't know how to call it, and let's call it love. There is something about that distance that allows proximity, you know. And obviously every character, I don't know, in the beginning has like the hair of that person, the nose of that other person, and says, I don't know, sentences that some of your friends used to say, and you are always mixing and creating by mixing. But I thought that that opportunity as very useful to get to know them, and so I wrote their poems, and then I decided what poems I might use. It was obviously easier to play with the rhymes, and in the beginning, you know, the first poems Gonzalo writes are not good. I think they are not good, but readers have the right to like them.
But you're writing them with the intention of making them. Some of the poems you're writing with the intention of them being from a writer who isn't writing good poetry.
Yeah, it was more because in Bolaño you never get to read the poems they write, and I love that. But it was more like the Nabokov way, you know, the Nabokov way. Yeah, like he does the opposite. I mean, you get to read the poem and get to interpretations and readings, and it's another kind of getting to their minds. But something really weird happened because you know, this poem Garfield, the poem written by Gonzalo, which is supposedly the only poem he wrote that might be considered a good poem. Well, it's a poem about cemeteries. It's about the new cemeteries. I call the new cemeteries to those cemeteries that all of a sudden appeared in my country early in the 90s. Parque del Recuerdo, Parque del Sendero. All those cemeteries arrived in a way to Chile, and they were different because as many cemeteries now in the world, they are more like golf courses, and pain was like obliterated. Pain wasn't visible. Pain is obviously around, but kids are always like happy to go to those places because they are like parks, you know. 25 years ago, I went to one of those cemeteries, and I saw these graves with the toys. It's like the most heartbreaking image, you know, like graves of kids, you know, and I was there, and I went through the whole cemetery, and I was looking to those graves and the toys and the teddy bears, and it was really overwhelming and sad. And so I tried to write about that for a long time. That was an idea, an image that came to my mind, and I was trying to write a poem about it, and trying to get to something, starting with that painful image, and I was never able to. And when I was writing this novel, and I was trying to write Gonzalo's poem, and I remembered that same experience, and I wrote the poem in like 4 minutes.
Wow.
You know, so I needed to be someone else in order to write that poem.
Yeah.
Or maybe I needed Gonzalo for writing that poem. I wouldn't say that poem is mine, you know.
Yeah, I love
It
that.
was really like I was living with him for a long while, because when you, I know this is a cliche, but when you write a novel, you are living with those characters for a long time, and you love them and you hate them, and you understand them, and so writing these poems uh, maybe was too much, no? like too much proximity. But I like it, that idea that they would have a visible work, and then I used this image, and it obviously I didn't think about it that much. I mean, if I would have thought about it, maybe I wouldn't have written it, because I would have started dealing with the same feeling that stopped me when I was trying to write the poem directly, you know. But with this character in between, I got to write it.
That's a great story. So I want to spend a little bit of time with the American journalist Prue, who you mentioned, who comes and sort of accidentally is writing a feature on the contemporary Chilean poetry scene. But kind of like your own journalism, she's not focusing on the most obvious people, but the grassroots poetry community, the secondary characters, and all of their passions and insecurities and divisions and successes. Often these gatherings and parties of poets that have a lot of drama and a lot of comedy. And it reminded me a lot of Bolaño's characters, who are philosophers and poets, who are having these conversations within their own fields. And Prue even thinks that she even says that some of the people she's meeting are reminding her of Bolaño characters herself. But because I don't know the poetry scene in Chile, I don't know how many of these characters are based on real people that might be recognizable to a Chilean reader, or how completely invented they are. But I feel a lot of love in the way you're portraying them, even when you're making fun of them. So, or maybe even sometimes when you're making fun of them, I feel the love the most. And it somehow it makes me feel like, I don't know how you do this as a writer, but it somehow makes me feel like you somehow find a way to include yourself in the things you're making fun of. When you were writing about Ginsberg's family lexicon, you say, family lexicon is in fact a family autobiography, a self-portrait in the corner of the painting, with the small crowd of parents and siblings and friends and neighbors in the fore. The self that appears is never alone, and always, rather than describing herself, wants to talk about others. And I felt like somehow that there was some sort of way in which you were performing a self-portrait in the corner of this family autobiography of Chilean poets. But it's definitely one of the more pleasurable things about your writing overall is the way you create sort of an art ecosystem in your books that's generational through the way that you name music, which you do a lot, and you name books that characters are reading or debating. And there's this sense that we're getting a biography of the generation and the characters at the same time. And in this book we get poets who write 1,000-page books of poetry, poets who notice that there's no right-wing poets in Chile, so they write poetic monologues in the voice of torturers. And then real poets who refused to publish during the 17 years of the dictatorship. Though again, I'm not sure. Maybe they're all real poets. That's what I don't know, and it's interesting.
In a way, they are real, but it's like we said before, like I'm mixing them up.
Yes.
And it was really funny, and at the same time interesting to me to create a sense of community. Most of them, almost all of them, are invented, but some of them I thought it was stupid to invent them.
Yeah.
Like Nicanor Parra or Rosabeth Muñoz. So I got to know them, and I loved them, and they were really generous. They are really generous with me. So it was a kind of homage, but at the same time, I didn't want to create a character named Nicolás Parra instead of Nicanor Parra. I mean, right. I most of the poets are like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 poems, 5 poets into one character, and so. But I don't know what a Chilean reader would exactly recognize. You know, I can imagine that my fellows, most of the readers that read the manuscript were like aware of this possibly. I mean, but it's not a roman clef. It's not the word in English, the expression.
Yeah.
It's not like hiding or playing with that exactly. I mean, it's more like a community that I think it is very Chilean, but I have been told that the same thing happens in other countries. I mean, this novel is a lot about national myths. You know, one of the most important national myths we have in Chile is poetry. I mean, it's hard to live really far away from a street called Pablo Neruda or Gabriela Mistral, and you would ask people in Chile whether we have good poetry or not, and I'm absolutely sure everyone would answer we have a great poetry, even though they don't like poetry and they don't relate to poetry, and they would even don't know what poetry is about. We all know that we have good poets, and it's a paradox, obviously. But it's the only thing that we know that we won the World Cup, you know, like twice because of this Nobel Prize and this whole culture of award-winning people, you know. So people would know that we are supposedly or that we are maybe good poets, but and you can feel proud about that, even though you don't give a shit about poetry. I mean, many friends had this same stupid discussion with Argentinians, you know, like they don't have Nobel prizes, and so after they beat us in soccer, you know, and they got drunk and they start talking about and making fun of the Chileans. But we won 2 Nobel prizes and you don't. That's a very
I love that
thing. But it's about national myths and how do you deal with them? I mean, in a way, when I was 14 years old or 15 years old and I wanted to become a poet, well, it was crazy, but it didn't seem that crazy to me, because poets were around. And we heard about them, and it was a world that wasn't hidden. I mean, it was free.
Yeah.
You know, you had to pay for the books. You had to go to a bookstore, and you want to read a novel. Okay, you have to pay for it, and books were and are very expensive in Chile. But poetry was more related to photocopies and to sharing and old books you would find, and you would go to a library and get some books, and you get to know people who also like poetry, and then a community started. And that's really beautiful about Such Detectives and the novel by Roberto Bolaño. I think when we read that novel, many of us were not reading novels, contemporary novels. I mean, I was reading classics, and all poetry interested to me. I was interested in all poetry, in the poems you just wrote, and in classics. But with prose, I was only interested in classics, you know. But there was this exception with Roberto Bolaño, and specifically with that novel, and that was so fun, and that we felt so close to it, and we shared the book, and we hated our country, and the only thing we liked about our country was poetry, and we thought we were alone. And there was this book that talked about people that we recognized, even though we didn't hear of them. We felt them really close, and that created not a sense of a community, because the community already existed. I mean, I was like 23 or 24 years old when I read the novel in 1999. You know? But I think made us loved our community, made us proud of belonging to that community. So yeah, it is a special position, the position of the poet in the Chilean society. That is weird. I mean, now we have like 2 newspapers in Chile, only 2, or maybe 3, or maybe 1.5. I don't know, but they don't really have cultural sections, or maybe they do, but it's not like it was 10 years before, you know. And for example, like 3 years ago, they stopped reviewing books. You know, there was no literary critic anymore, and from then on, they don't review books. They have a cultural section, but books are not included in. But they could easily get to interview a poet, you know. So they are not reviewing the book,
but talking to
they can interview the poet, and not about his or her books. It's about the way they see life. It's really interesting that I obviously this is not something I have studied, but I think like 4 times a year you would find like big interviews to different Chilean poets.
I wonder if this goes back to religion, like that these poets are like oracles.
Yeah, there's something about that, but it's like, I don't know if this word does exist in English. Free thinker. Mm-hmm. It's like a guy who sees the world from his own perspective. He is free to mix things up, and his vision or her vision is not obvious. I think that is the idea of a poet in Chile. It's related, obviously, to the cult of personality, which is something we've been dealing with for a long time. With the idea that we had this superstar. Neruda was so famous and so important worldwide when he was young. Even when he was young, he was so important. So there is this idea of the superstar, but we have the Nicanor Parra immediately, like deconstructing Neruda's way of being a poet and Neruda's way of writing poetry. So it was like the yin and the yang. They created a system where everything was allowed. I mean, the formal limits of Chilean poetry does not exist. Obviously, there are good poems and bad poems, good poets and bad poets. But what do you understand by the word poem, it's really avant-garde. I don't know how to say it, but I mean, Juan Luis Martinez, which is a great poet. Okay, you would read his books and you would ask yourself why is this even considered poetry? Because it's more like visual arts, and obviously we accept that and we include that into poetry because what anti-poetry did was expand the limits and obviously created discussions, long discussions, sometimes very hard discussions about the definition of poetry. You know?
So you knew Nicanor Parra in real life, and he's a character in this book. Your invented poets spend time in his house at various points in the book. What was it like taking this iconic anti-poet who in real life you knew and putting him in this fictional world? What were your considerations around that?
With Nicanor Parra, it's not that I wanted to put him in the novel. I mean, it was more like something that Prue would like to get to know him because of very professional reasons, I would say. I mean, she had to know the new poets, not the old ones, but in a way, he was there, and why not? And it's obviously something journalists would want. Go there and see what happens, and every journalist would know that it's really hard to get to an interview with Nicanor. That was always refusing interviews and sometimes playing the game that is played in the novel. I mean, accepting the interview, but when you got there, he was like reluctant and he was like, oh, please no recording, and so this is a situation I witnessed many times because I used to work with him. I was really lucky. I mean, long ago he translated King Lear into Chilean Spanish. It's a very, very, very good translation because he plays with the different levels of the language in King Lear. I mean, you know, this writing for the scene, this writing that ideally would entertain all sorts of sensibilities and that would have many layers. So Nicanor Parra translated it long ago. I think it was 1991. And then he refused to publish that translation. He had many offers, but he didn't want to publish it. And he was like, I will never publish this. But there was this publisher who insisted, and he accepted to finally, many years later, publish this translation. And this editor, Matias Rivas, this publisher, and Nicanor decided that they needed an editor of the text that, like, I don't know the word in English, it's the same, it's not the same word, but he needed someone to work with him with this manuscript and to make final decisions, and it was a long work. And I was lucky enough to be around, and Nicanor wanted someone like me, and we started working together. And it was a long work. I learned many things. I don't know whether they were related to literature. I think it was more learning about life, and he was one of my idols and one of my favorite poets. But I was discussing his poetry too. I mean, it's not that I was obedient, because it's really impressive what Nicanor Parra does. And I'm afraid he's not really very well edited now in the USA, because translations were published long ago. I hope that they will be reprinted. They will reprint them soon, because it's really amazing what happens when you read Nicanor Parra for the first time and you like poetry and you have the Nerudian imaginary or any other, like writing poems for your boyfriend or your girlfriend, and you realize this also considered poetry, even though it is called anti-poetry. It impresses you, and I think that still happens. When I was a teacher, for example, I had this classes where nobody would really have chosen to be there, like you studied like something, I don't know, economics or administration.
Yeah.
You are not related to poetry, but you have to feel credit. So you take this class,
Yeah.
and I was the teacher, and it was like for people who work the whole day. So it was like 8:30 p.m. and I was there talking to them about poetry. So it wasn't like the best situation for a learning process.
No.
But it was really interesting that to get their reactions about Nicanor Parra's poetry. And they didn't like poetry, but they were even, some of them amazed, some of them really hated that, and they were really mad at the mere idea that was considered something we should study. Really like this is not poetry. And I thought, well, 50 years later, this is still
powerful.
And the artifacts that Nicanor Parra wrote, and the way he chose to distract poetry was creating this one or two lines poems that we would read now and we would identify easily as tweets, or these artifacts that work like memes, but this was done early in the 70s. It's the Artifacts, which is a book of postcards. Formally, they are memes written 40 years earlier. So he was thinking about poetry and dealing with the idea of poetry and with the position of poetry, which is something really important and interesting, because he wasn't like I don't know how to say this, but he was not. He wanted to speak to everyone, So the minority, the idea of poetry as something that people rejects and ignores, he was fighting that idea, fighting against that idea. So it's really interesting the way he managed to create a poetry that could imply you and that could change you. So when I was a teenager, I was laughing. Maybe you don't expect to laugh when you read a poem. Maybe you are looking for something else. And so you like it, and at the same time you distrust it. And there's this debate that it is still going on about seriousness and poetry. And many people would still say that this is not poetry. I think that is way of winning. Like,
Yeah.
People are still discussing your work. I mean, that means a lot.
I feel like we can't end this conversation until we talk about the cat, which of course is taking this off in a very random different direction, but who knows, maybe not. But there's a cat on the cover, a cat with fangs, who reminds me of Bulgakov's character in Master and Margarita a little bit.
Popotka was the name of the cat?
I think it was Behemoth, wasn't it?
Ah.
Was it? Or maybe I think in English it's Behemoth.
Let me find this out, because I've been making a big mistake for a long time. The name of the cat. Popotka. Behemoth.
Yeah.
But in English. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder what's his name in Spanish.
Maybe it is what you remember. In a way, I feel like it's the opportunity for Vincente, the stepson, to be a father himself. Maybe he's the stepfather to the cat. But there's this theme of lying in the book that I'm curious about, I guess, around the cat too, because both Carla and Gonzalo are not really telling Vincente what's true about the cat's health, partially because of economics. But Vincente is distrustful in a larger way. Like there's this question around Santa Claus and how Vincente is concerned that all the adults have gotten together to agree to lie to children about Santa Claus. And he's been reassured that that's not the case. And then there's Gonzalo, who's lying to Carla about which poems are his and which ones. Like, he hands her poems written by other people, which she really likes. And she's not a big poetry fan, but she's particularly not a big fan of most of Gonzalo's poetry. But I'm curious about the cat, who's not really a secondary character, maybe a tertiary character. Why does the cat end up on the cover? What is the cat? The cat means something.
Yeah.
I'm not asking you to reduce it to a meaning, but I guess speak to us about the cat a little bit.
I have a short answer that maybe should be the only answer. The cat is really cute. So no, I mean, this is the only autobiographical, 100% autobiographical thing of this novelist. This cat named Oscuridad in Spanish, darkness in English, and I really. I am really into cats. I mean, I obviously cannot explain exactly why, but maybe it's what we all have seen, like these domestic animals that are not fully domesticated, that are really different, and each of them is a whole world, and you don't get to know whether they trust you or not, and when as Borges said in this beautiful poem, it's like you caress them, it's like they are accepting that, like making you a favor,
Yeah.
And they are sophisticated and wild, and at the same time are there, and sometimes they seem to love you, and sometimes they seem to hate you. So it's really like dealing with life, you know. You can learn a lot by watching them, and it's the same with kids, with toddlers, you know, the newborns. It's like they are teaching you many things when you are supposed to be taking care of them, and parents always like their kids to be dogs, but they are cats, you know. They are wild and passionate, and inescrutable. Is that a word?
Inscrutable.
It's inescrutable, and as we all are, we all are inescrutable, and when you see yourself this close, you know that you are really complex and really stupid at the same time. So mystery, I think it's related to cats. I was a teacher of a very, very interesting class about literature and cats. It was really, really, really like a great experience, and because they are like obviously natural characters for mystery, but also for tenderness, and they are really there are many, many, many great literature, great poetry, great novels, and great short stories about cats. So it was really something I would like to do again, and I would like people to do, because it's liberating. I mean, you can talk about many kinds of literature, and at the same time, it seems like you're always talking about cats. Everybody has experiences, and I was really I loved that class, because I had these 3 students that were cat haters. That was really interesting. It's like 20 people, 17 were cat lovers, and 3 of them were dog lovers and cat haters. And the discussions were really, really sophisticated and interesting.
I want to take this class. I want to take the class the next time you teach it. Did you teach Colette's book, The Cat?
Yeah.
You did?
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And I kind of distrust the idea of topics, in literature, and that's what that piece you just read, Free Topic, is about. But having said that, it's really good to use the idea of a topic to teach literature. So in that way, that class about cats was great, because I had this excuse, but we got to really talk about what writing and reading is about, and we really enjoyed it. And the other day I was talking with my wife that was a big fan of All Possum's book of Practical Cats, the book by T.S. Eliot, but because she came across the Cats musical, so she liked it, and she got to the book in English when she was really I don't know, like 11 years old or something, and loved the All Possum's book of Practical Cats, and learned some poems by heart. So she said to herself, I really like this guy, T.S. Eliot. I'm going to order another book by him. And it was the 4 Quartets. The Wasteland.
Yes.
But maybe that's why she became a writer. Who don't know? Who knows?
Yeah, I love that. Well, to sort of end where we began, I want to return to Kate Briggs, who said in The Believer, "What continues for me is this desire for the novel, what Barthes calls the long form, the longest form. There is something about the length, and so therefore also about the duration of engagement, and the way this reading time has to be interrupted and kind of extended by life, because a long form can't be read all at once, which fascinates me. It has always fascinated me, I think. In Not to Read, Alejandro Zambra has a piece called Festival of the Long Novel, describing a project for a literary festival which never happened. But I wish it would. I would love more than anything to sit with other readers and practitioners of the longest form and try to work this fascination out. I guess thinking of your attempt to create a festival of the long novel, especially as a novelist who himself is known for your short, even sometimes miniature novels, and also thinking how this novel, I don't think this novel could be called a long novel by most standards, but it's long for you. It's definitely your longest novel. Is that what we can expect from you in the future? Your as of yet fantastical long novel. Is that what's coming next?
Actually, I am writing a novel about that, but I don't know whether it is a short novel or a long novel. I don't care about that, but I get what it means as a reader to face a long novel, and that's what I'm kind of writing about. I mean, it's a novel I wrote in English, so you can imagine how bad it is, the original, because I was living in New York and I came across this idea, and I decided to write in English for the same reasons that if you would go to a place, you can start a diary in that language, and you would really get to something, but not necessarily what I was supposed to get. I mean, it was bad writing, and it was so funny, you know. As an exercise, it's very good in workshops, like to write something in a language you don't really know, or to use like 10 words for creating something, and the only thing allowed is to combine those words. And I loved all those exercises all my life, but in this case, I was living in New York, and I decided to write in English, and to write. Obviously, the result was going to be bad, but my idea was to try to make it good, you know. So it was not it was like a contradiction, but at the same time, I decided not to use the dictionary. That was a rule I was playing with. So sometimes, if I didn't know the word door, the character should get out using the window, you know. so it was some parts of those movements stayed in the original, which is something nobody is going to read ever, you know. It's really bad writing, but I did write a novel. And what I'm doing now is translating it into Spanish, and it's really funny because sometimes one page in English is 10 pages in Spanish, and sometimes 2 pages in English is one sentence in Spanish, you know. So wow. It's really like because I was dealing. It was a game, obviously, but I like that. I mean, I divide a lot, writing and then publishing. I mean, to me are two totally different things, and I would always want writing to be a game. I don't want to be a professional. I mean, I'm supposed to be one, but it's not that I am. I would never publish a book. I feel obligated to. And a lot of my writing is about failing and drafting, and I really like that. And I think this is the way you get to something that later you can turn into a book and publish it, and obviously that is a decision. But with this book, I think I'm right in the moment where I can say that I'm going to publish it someday, or I want it to be related to readers. And I don't know whether this is going to be long or not. And it's not going to be a long novel, but it is about a long novel in the book itself.
Well, you've said that publishing a book, contrary to what most people say, is not like giving birth to a baby, but more like when your kid leaves home.
Yeah, I think so.
And I feel like I can speak for a lot of people that we're grateful that your kid has arrived in the United States. And I also think it's your best book child yet. So I wanted to thank you for being on the show, Alejandro.
Thank you for having me. I have to say that I have never given birth. So I was just using the metaphor. But I do think that you stay with the kid for years, and then they leave, and you want them to be fine and to have generous readers like you. So I'm grateful, and thank you for this conversation. Sorry for my English. You can be sure I'm smarter or less stupid in Spanish, but thank you. It's been really nice and great talking to you, and some of the things you said are going to stay with me, because I really felt that something was going on when you well, okay. Estoy hablando muy mal ahora, pero what I mean is that it's been a pleasure.
For me as well. We've been talking today to Alejandro Zambra about his latest book, Chilean Poet, translated by Megan McDowell. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength, makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. If you enjoyed today's conversation, help ensure the future of conversations just like this by joining the community of Between the Covers listener supporters. You can find out more about all the potential benefits of becoming a listener supporter, from rare collectibles to bonus audio to the Tin House Early Readership Program at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. For today's bonus audio, we have a long-form interview with Zambra's career-spanning translator, Megan McDowell, which joins conversations with Jenny Erpenbeck's translator, Kurt Beals, with Fernanda Melchor's translator, Sophie Hughes, with Abdella Taya's translator, Emma Ramadan, and Dubravka Ugresich's translator, Ellen Elias Bursic, among many others. Again, you can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Jacob Valla in the art department, Becky Kramer, publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the Summer and Winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating the outro. Their album Imre Lodbrog, A Zapatita Me, can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.